Have you ever met someone who's too perfect, polite, intelligent, always knows what to say? That was Clark Rockefeller. At least, that's who everyone thought he was. For over a decade, this man moved through some of the most powerful social circles in Boston, Massachusetts, art collectors, investment bankers, even Harvard graduates, all believing they were speaking to a member of one of America's oldest and wealthiest families. He dressed the part, tailored suits, old money vocabulary, a faint accent that sounded somewhere between British and cultured American. He'd talk about his family estate in New Hampshire, his private art acquisitions, and weekends in Nantucket. Every detail, perfectly believable. But there was one problem. None of it was true. It began to unravel in 2008 when Rockefeller's wife, Sandra Boss, filed for divorce. She was a successful business consultant, smart, sharp, cautious. Yet somehow she too had been living with a man whose entire life was a fabrication. Even the name Clark Rockefeller didn't exist. The court ordered supervised visitation with their daughter. One quiet Sunday, during a walk in Boston's Back Bay, he turned and whispered to his daughter, "We're going on an adventure." Then he shoved the social worker escort to the ground, grabbed his daughter and vanished into the crowd. It was broad daylight. Witnesses saw a man in sunglasses and a blue cap rush into a black SUV. By the time police arrived, he was gone. The FBI launched one of the most extensive manhunts of the decade. An Amber Alert went nationwide. Every media outlet in America flashed the same face. Clark Rockefeller, alleged kidnapper, wanted for child abduction. But here's where it gets strange. When investigators dug into his background, college records, birth certificate, even tax filings, they found nothing. No trace of him anywhere before 1993. It was as if the man had appeared out of thin air. A week later, they tracked him down in Baltimore, Maryland, living under yet another fake identity. Chip Smith, a supposed yacht consultant. The girl was found safe, but the real horror began when they started piecing together who he actually was. The fingerprints didn't match anyone in the U.S. database, so they tried Interpol, and that's when they discovered his real name. Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter, a German exchange student who had entered America in the late 1970s and vanished under dozens of false identities ever since. He had lied to universities, churches, landlords, even the FBI, for decades, and somehow he'd fooled them all. But the deeper they dug, the darker it got. Because behind the charming fake Rockefeller, they found something buried in a California backyard. When the FBI traced Clark Rockefeller back to his true name, Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter, they thought they were dealing with a con artist, maybe a chronic liar. They had no idea they were about to uncover a murder. The trail led them west, to a quiet suburb in San Marino, California, just outside Pasadena. A postcard-perfect neighborhood where nothing ever went wrong. But in 1985, a young couple had vanished there without a trace, John and Linda Sohus. Back then, Gerhardsreiter had been calling himself Christopher Chichester. He rented the guest house behind the Sohus family home, introduced himself as a British filmmaker, and told neighbors he was working on a documentary for the BBC. He was eccentric, charming, polite, the kind of man who left people saying, "He's odd but harmless." Until one spring morning, when John and Linda disappeared, neighbors were told they'd gone to New York for work. That story came straight from Chichester's mouth. Weeks passed, then months. The letters that supposedly came from the missing couple looked strange. Formal, typed, cold. And one day Chichester vanished too. No police case, no arrests. Just another unsolved mystery in a quiet town. Fast forward to 1994. A new family bought the Sohus property. They decided to install a swimming pool in the backyard. And that's when a construction worker's shovel hit something hard. Plastic, then bone. Wrapped deep beneath the soil, near the old guest house. Authorities identified the remains through fragments of clothing and a name tag from John Sohus's old NASA job. But Linda's body was never found. It was as if she had been erased from the earth. For years, the case went cold again. No suspects, no DNA, no motive. Then came 2008, and the kidnapping case in Boston. When the FBI realized Rockefeller was actually Chichester, the puzzle finally snapped together. The man who'd fooled millionaires, professors, and federal agents had also buried a man behind his rented home. It was no longer just a story about a fraud. It was a story about a killer who wore a charm like a mask. Investigators returned to the San Marino site. They found traces of soil and chemical residue matching the same materials Gerhardt's writer had used for photography and filmmaking in the 80s. Every test, every timeline pointed to him. He'd fled across decades and identities, leaving no footprints except one, a shallow grave in a suburban garden. When they told the FBI profiler leading the case, he said one sentence that stayed with me. He wasn't just lying about who he was lying about being human. And that was the moment everyone realized this wasn't over. By the time investigators pieced his trail together, Christian Karl Gerhardt's writer had already lived half a dozen lives, each one more convincing than the last. After fleeing California in the mid-1980s, he turned up in Connecticut under a new identity, Christopher Crowe. He dressed immaculately, carried himself like an Ivy League graduate, and told everyone he was working on Wall Street. In truth, he didn't have a bank account, a resume, or a social security number. But that didn't matter. He spoke with such confidence that people never questioned him. When asked for proof, he'd laugh lightly and say, "My dear, you'll have to trust me, it's confidential." It always worked. Neighbors remembered the man as mysterious but cultured, the kind who discussed art, wine, and politics like he belonged in the upper class. When police later traced his aliases, they found a trail of unpaid rents, forged checks, and sudden disappearances. Each time he was close to being caught, he simply became someone else. And every identity, Chichester, Crowe, Rockefeller, was built with eerie precision. Accent, background, even handwriting, it wasn't luck. It was practice. By the late 1990s, he had rebranded himself one last time, Clark Rockefeller, a supposed member of the legendary American dynasty. The name alone opened doors. He attended exclusive art shows in New York, joined elite clubs, and married a Harvard-educated executive, Sandra Boss. For years, she believed she'd married into wealth. They lived in million-dollar homes, surrounded by symbols of success, antique paintings, old family portraits, books that looked inherited rather than bought. But behind those walls, everything was an illusion. No bank statements, no visits from relatives, no traceable phone numbers. When Sandra finally asked questions, he told her the family had security reasons and didn't like outsiders. She believed him, until one night, he locked himself in his study and whispered over the phone to someone who didn't exist. That was when she realized she didn't even know who she was living with. When she filed for divorce, the mask cracked. The polite accent vanished. The calm smile faded. He became paranoid, erratic, controlling, as if his entire world was collapsing under the weight of its own lie. And in a way it was, because for Christian Gerhardt's writer, identity wasn't just a disguise. It was the only thing keeping the darkness inside him from surfacing. The FBI would later say he was a walking paradox. Brilliant, charming, utterly cold. He'd built a perfect American life, on a foundation of bones. It all came undone on a warm July afternoon in Baltimore, Maryland, 2008. By then, the name Clark Rockefeller was plastered across every news channel in America. The man who had once fooled Boston's elite was now wanted for kidnapping his own daughter, and the FBI was closing in fast. A witness had spotted a man and a little girl entering a quiet townhouse under the names Chip and Snooks Smith. The tip sounded absurd at first, but when agents ran the fingerprints from a coffee mug left behind, the match hit. Christian Karl Gerhardt's writer, the con man, the imposter, the ghost of San Marino. When the SWAT team moved in, he didn't run. He opened the door calmly, dressed in a pressed shirt, and greeted them with perfect manners. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "this must be a misunderstanding." But the moment the handcuffs clicked, the mask finally shattered. He wasn't the cultured Rockefeller anymore, just a trembling man whose web of lies had finally caught up with him. Inside the FBI interrogation room, he remained strangely composed. He corrected agents' grammar, commented on their shoes, and spoke in circles. Every answer was another story, another identity. Even his lies had layers. One agent later said, "It felt like questioning an actor who forgot where the stage ended." Back in Boston, Sandra Boss faced the cameras for the first time. She described how she'd lived with a man who didn't exist, how even his childhood photos were fabricated, how every memory she'd shared with him now felt like a scene from someone else's movie. Her voice cracked when she said, "He looked me in the eye every day and lied about everything, including his name." The story exploded across the country. How could a man deceive everyone, even the FBI, for nearly 3 decades? But as the kidnapping case turned into a media circus, the FBI made a discovery that shifted everything. In a dusty evidence locker in Los Angeles County sat an old file marked Sohu's John, cold case. Inside were photos of the skeleton found in 1994, the one buried in San Marino. The new investigators compared details, timeline, fingerprints, the guesthouse tenant's name. Everything pointed back to the same man. Gerhardt's writer wasn't just a liar. He was a murderer. When agents told him what they'd found, he smiled faintly and said, "You can't prove what doesn't exist." But this time, the story was over. The FBI had him, not the myth, not the persona, but the man behind the mask. The trial of Christian Karl Gerhardt's writer, the man once known as Clark Rockefeller, began in Los Angeles, 2013. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered like vultures. It wasn't just another murder case. It was the unmasking of one of America's greatest imposters. The prosecution's opening statement was simple and chilling. For decades, this man lied, manipulated, and deceived. But beneath every false identity, there was always the same darkness. And that darkness took a life in 1985. Inside the courtroom, Christian sat perfectly still, wearing a navy blazer, his hair slicked back neatly. To the jury, he didn't look like a killer. He looked like a professor, maybe an art dealer. The very illusion that had fooled so many before. But evidence doesn't lie. Prosecutors showed the jury photos of the San Marino backyard, where John Sohus's bones had been found. They described how the tenant, calling himself Christopher Chichester, vanished the same week John and Linda disappeared. They produced receipts, bags of concrete, new shovels, and freshly poured gravel ordered by Chichester. Even the tools matched the construction marks on the skull. And then came the witness, Sandra Boss. She spoke calmly, her voice steady. She described how her ex-husband had manipulated her, how his stories never added up, and how he once said, "People who dig into the past usually regret it." The courtroom went silent. Christian's defense claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof he'd killed John Sohus. But when FBI analysts reconstructed the timeline, it became undeniable. The lies, the move from California to Connecticut, then to New York, and finally to Boston. Every escape matched the discovery of a new identity. He'd spent his life running from a crime he thought would stay buried. During closing arguments, the prosecutor said, "He deceived the elite. He deceived the FBI. But the one thing he couldn't deceive was time." When the jury returned after 6 hours of deliberation, not a single person looked at him. The foreman spoke softly. "Guilty of murder in the first degree." Christian didn't flinch. He adjusted his cufflinks, smiled faintly, and whispered something under his breath. No one could hear what it was. The judge sentenced him to 27 years to life. For the first time, the man who had fooled everyone would live under his real name, in a place where no new identity could save him. But even as the verdict echoed through the courtroom, one question remained. What happened to Linda Sohus, John's wife, who vanished with him in 1985 and was never found? Some believe Christian buried her somewhere else. Others think she escaped him and has spent her life hiding from the same man who deceived the world. Quentin State Prison, 2020. The man who once called himself Clark Rockefeller now lived in a 6x8 cell under his real name. Christian Karl Gerhardt's writer. No private jets. No tailored suits. Just concrete walls, a steel bed, and a name tag that finally told the truth. Every morning, guards said he followed the same ritual. He'd sit on his bunk, comb his hair carefully, and read the Wall Street Journal as if still preparing for a board meeting. He never spoke about the murder, never admitted, never denied. When asked who he really was, he smiled and said, "Depends who's asking." Outside the prison, the legend grew darker. True crime documentaries dissected every lie, every alias. The FBI called him a master manipulator. Psychologists called him a high-functioning sociopath. But one mystery still haunted the case: Linda Sohus. No trace of her was ever found. Not a bone, not a document, not a single confirmed sighting after 1985. Over the years, investigators revisited the San Marino property, hoping new technology might uncover what they'd missed. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 2 disturbed soil patches near the old guest house. Yet when they dug, there was nothing. Only a single silver earring buried deep in the dirt. It was Linda's style, but never proven hers. In 2019, a retired FBI profiler who had once worked the case visited the prison to speak with Christian one last time. He asked, "Why did you do it? The lies, the names, the killing?" Christian looked up from his book, The Great Gatsby, and smirked. "Because everyone believes what they want to believe. I just gave them something worth believing in." He turned a page unbothered. That was his confession, not of guilt, but of control. March 5th, 2023. Christian Karl Gerhardtsreiter suffered a mild stroke in his cell. He survived, but for the first time his mind began to fade. He forgot names, places, years. The man who once built entire lives out of lies could no longer remember his own. Some called it justice. Others called it irony. Today the San Marino house still stands, remodeled, repainted, but never truly cleansed. The new owners say at night dogs bark at the empty backyard, and when the wind shifts, they sometimes hear footsteps near the old guest house, the place where a fake name once hid a real monster. The world remembers him not as Clark Rockefeller, or Christopher Chichester, or Chip Smith, but as the man who fooled everyone, even the FBI. And somewhere out there, under California soil or beyond it, Linda Sohu still keeps her silence. The end.